Hi everyone, welcome back once again to my educational channel on biology. In this video, we are going to study subtopic 12.4 of our biology Form 4 syllabus entitled Voluntary Actions and Involuntary Actions. So every day we are carrying out these two different types of actions. For example, even right now your heart is beating, you are breathing and you are blinking your eyes. So let's take an example of an involuntary action like the reflex action shown here. It's called the knee-jerk reaction. Watch it. Now, how does this reaction occur? Let's find out more. The learning standards for this video are as follows. Voluntary and involuntary actions. Firstly, after this lesson, we should be able to compare and contrast voluntary and involuntary actions. Secondly, we should be able to describe the reflex actions involving two neurons, such as the knee-jerk reflex, and another type of reflex action involving three neurons, such as moving the finger or hand away from a sharp pin or an object that's hot. Thirdly, we should be able to draw a reflex arc for reflex actions. First of all, let's discuss the two types of actions that we carry out every day. These are voluntary actions and involuntary actions. So let's look first of all at voluntary actions. A voluntary action is an action that we are conscious of and which is done on our own free will, such as running, talking, and writing. For example, we can decide when we want to start running or stop running. So we are aware of it, we are conscious of it. Tindakan yang dikawal secara disedari, right? And we can control the action. Now, so voluntary actions involve the contractions of skeletal muscles, which are muscles attached to the bones. And these muscles are controlled by the cerebrum of the brain, the largest part of the brain here, or controlled by the cerebral cortex, meaning the outermost layer of the brain here, right? Now, next we have the involuntary actions, which are actions that occur automatically without us being conscious. Examples are sneezing, vomiting, and heartbeat. Okay, so the key word here is automatically. It occurs without our conscious thought and is not controlled by our conscious mind, right? Now, there are two types of involuntary actions. A, those that involve the skeletal muscles, and B, those that involve smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, or glands. Now, for A, those that involve the skeletal muscles, these type of actions occur very fast, such as the knee-jerk response or reflex, and these type of actions are called reflex actions, which are actions that occur automatically and very quickly without conscious control. So, examples of reflex actions, there are two types of reflex actions, and these are the spinal reflexes and the cranial reflexes. Spinal reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord and they occur below the head, all right, in the regions of the body below the head. Okay, so the spinal cord is the control center because it's nearer, right, to these parts of the body where the action occurs. And there are two types of spinal reflexes that we're going to study, the knee-jerk reflex and also moving the hand or object, moving the hand away from a hot object or an object that causes pain, right? So we're going to study these two reflexes that involve either 2 or 3 neurons. Now, cranial reflex occur in the region of the head. Examples are blinking your eyes when dust gets into the eye. Before the dust gets in your eye, you will start to blink and it close to protect the eye from the dust, right? So cranial reflexes are controlled by the medulla oblongata. So in this video, we're going to discuss voluntary actions. We're going to discuss writing an essay involving voluntary actions, and we're going to discuss reflex actions. Those that involve 2 neurons, the reflex action that involves 2 neurons, and another one involving 3 neurons. Okay, So we'll discuss 3 essay questions in this video. How to write the process of transmission of information or impulses. The pathway of transmission of information or impulses in a voluntary action or a reflex action. Now there's another type of involuntary action, which is P here. They involve the smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, or glands. For example, an involuntary action that involves the smooth muscles will be peristalsis, which is the alternate contraction and relaxation of the smooth muscles in parts like the digestive system, in the esophagus, intestines, or even in the contraction of smooth muscles in the walls of arteries. Now, secondly, involuntary actions that involve cardiac muscles. Okay, this cause the heart to beat when the cardiac muscles contract and relax. And thirdly, involuntary actions that involve the glands. An example is salivation. So if we look at some delicious food, the saliva is produced or secreted from the salivary glands. That is salivation. So all these types of involuntary actions here, these 3 types, are controlled by the medulla oblongata, which is the lower part of the brain, right near the spinal cord. So now we are going to compare and contrast voluntary and involuntary actions. In the exam, you may be given 2 types of actions. For example, a picture of a man eating, another picture of a person who is coughing. Then you may be asked to compare and contrast, right? So by giving examples, compare and contrast voluntary and involuntary actions. All right. So examples of voluntary actions are running, talking, and eating. And for involuntary actions, heartbeats, peristalsis, coughing, and the knee-jerk reflex. Now, so we have to give the similarities and the differences if we are asked to compare and contrast. So the similarity between these 2 types of actions, voluntary and involuntary actions, are that both actions involve a stimulus. There are nerve impulses involved, the neurons, such as sensory neurons and motor neurons, and an effector organ, such as muscles or glands. Now, differences. So let's look at the 4 differences here. Firstly, a voluntary action is an action that we are conscious of and done on our own will, whereas an involuntary action is an action that occurs automatically without us being conscious of it, and we cannot control it with our free will. Now, type of nervous system involved. So for voluntary action, it involves the somatic nervous system in the body, and for involuntary action, it involves the autonomous or autonomic nervous system. Not automatic, autonomous nervous system. All right, that means impulses will flow through this autonomous nervous system if it is involuntary action. Control center for voluntary action is the cerebrum. All right, textbook writes cerebral cortex. Now the cortex is the surface layer of the cerebrum. Okay, the outermost layer of the cerebrum. And then for involuntary actions is controlled by the medulla oblongata, hypothalamus, or spinal cord. Especially for reflex actions that involve skeletal muscles, the control center is the spinal cord, as we'll find out after this. And then for medulla oblongata, it controls involuntary actions like peristalsis, coughing, and heartbeat. Okay, effector. Effector means the part of the body that responds to the stimulus. So for voluntary action, it involves a response by the skeletal muscles. That means the effector are the skeletal muscles. Effectors are the skeletal muscles in different parts of the body. And for involuntary actions, the effectors are the smooth muscles and glands. So involuntary action involves a response or reaction by the smooth muscles in the body. Smooth muscles are attached to the walls, found in the walls of the arteries and also the digestive tract, like the esophagus, stomach, and so forth. Now, there's another difference, which is voluntary actions have to be learned. Okay, normally they are learned, whereas for involuntary actions like reflex actions, they are inborn. We don't learn them. They already are there naturally, even in a baby that is born. They have certain types of reflex actions. So first of all, let's study voluntary actions, and then we'll study involuntary actions after that. Now, voluntary actions involving skeletal muscles. So voluntary actions such as walking, talking, and brushing teeth are all conscious actions that we are aware of when we are doing it. For example, you can voluntarily raise your hand to answer a question. And voluntary actions involve skeletal muscles that are attached to our bones, and they're controlled by the cerebral cortex, which is the outermost layer of the cerebrum, right? Since this information reaches the cerebral cortex here, that is our level of consciousness, our perception of the surroundings can be produced, and we are aware of the action when we are doing it. Okay, and we can also control it. We can start it and stop the action. So we must be able to explain the information pathway in the voluntary actions, right? So the picture here shows you the control center of the brain, the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum that controls voluntary actions. And the muscles here are the skeletal muscles that are controlled by the cerebrum in the voluntary actions, like lifting your hand or lifting an object with your hand or straightening your arm. Okay, lifting your arm or straightening your arm. And this picture shows you all the skeletal muscles that are attached to the bone in the body, okay, which are used to carry out voluntary actions. Now here we revise the three types of muscle tissues or cells. Cardiac muscles are found in the heart, and they are the effectors for involuntary action, that is the contraction and relaxation of the cardiac muscle, which causes the heart to beat. All right. So another effector for involuntary actions are the smooth muscles. For example, the smooth muscles found in the small and large intestine and in the stomach and esophagus. So the smooth muscles in these places are all effectors for involuntary actions such as peristalsis, which is the alternate contraction and relaxation of the smooth muscles in the walls of the alimentary tract or alimentary the walls of the alimentary tract, okay, to push the food down forward in the alimentary tract. But for skeletal muscles, as shown here, all right, they are used as effectors for voluntary actions. They carry out voluntary actions, and they carry out the responses to certain stimuli, all right, for voluntary actions or in the voluntary actions. Now, before we go on, we have to know the various components of a coordinating system. All right, they're altogether around 7 components, starting with the stimulus. So stimulus is a change in the environment. It is detected by a receptor, which can be found in the sensory organs like the ears, eyes, and nose. And also there are receptors in the internal organs in the body. All right. So when a receptor detects a stimulus, it is stimulated and it will trigger the production of a nerve impulse in the receptor. So this receptor produces the nerve impulse, which is transmitted by the sensory neuron to the control center or integrating center called the brain or the spinal cord, right? So this is the central nervous system. Now in the brain or spinal cord, there are many relay neurons, which are like the intermediate neurons that connect the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, right? So the impulse will travel from sensory neuron to relay neurons and then to motor neurons. So the job of the motor neuron is to transmit nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors. And then effectors such as muscles or glands will carry out the response. And then we have to identify what the response is. Okay? So take note of stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, brain or spinal cord, motor neuron, muscle gland, and then response. So right away, I'm going to give you the super memory tip that you can use to explain the pathway of transmission of information or impulses for voluntary or involuntary actions. This is part of the learning standard and also is important for essay and structured questions, right? So as we know, we have about 7 or 8 components. Okay, here there are about 10 components that you have to, 11 components that you have to remember when you are going to explain the pathway of transmission of information for either voluntary actions or involuntary actions. All right. Now, basically, we start with the stimulus. You must mention what the stimulus or the change in the environment is. It could be light, it could be sound, it could be heat or pain. So the stimulus is detected by the receptor. So identify what receptor it is. For example, if a pin were to prick the skin, then the stimulus is pain, and the receptor is called the pain receptors or the nociceptor, as we have studied in the earlier topic, right? Earlier subtopic. Now, so stimulus is detected by a receptor which produces a nerve impulse, I for impulse. So SRI, SRI. Second part is SABRI. SABRI. So SABRI is the name of a person. It stands for sensory neuron. The impulse is transmitted by the sensory neuron from receptor to the brain or spinal cord. So it's either SABRI, B for brain, or SASRI. And then from the spinal cord, it travels, the impulse will be transmitted to the relay from the brain or spinal cord, or in the brain or spinal cord, the impulse is translated from sensory neuron to relay neuron. And if it's the brain will analyze the information and maybe make a decision as to what to do. Okay, so a new impulse is produced, and an impulse is produced and is transmitted from relay neuron to the motor neuron. Okay, so SABRI here stands for sensory neuron, B for brain, and S for spinal cord, R for relay neuron, and I is for the impulse. All right, just keep mentioning the impulse. So relay neuron transmits the impulse to motor neuron. Now this is the last part at the effector. The motor neuron then transmits the impulse to the effector. Okay, and then the effector is either the muscle or gland, which will carry out the response. For example, the muscle may contract. All right, for example, in this person who is going to swing his racket to hit the shuttlecock in badminton, he has to move his arm, right? So his biceps muscle will have to contract, right? And his triceps muscle, you also have to contract later on. So contraction of muscle causes the response. Maybe the hand will use the racket to hit the shuttlecock, right? So we have MEMR, motor emak mudah rosak. All right. So it's not easy to really come up with a very specific acronym, but here we have it. It's already done for you. All you need to do is to memorize this sentence. All right. So imagine the story behind Sri Sabri is a very good mechanic. So one day his mother came to him. The motor here is probably the motorbike, right? When you say motor, usually you mean the motorbike. So motor emak mudah rosak. So the mother asked him to repair the motorbike for her. She can use the motorbike, okay, to move around. So Sri Sabri, motor emak mudah rosak. You have firstly the components in the receptor, what happens at the receptor, and then Sabri is for the components that are found in the central nervous system, right? And then motor emak mudah rosak. This is at the effector. All right. Okay, let's try and apply what we have learned here to our questions. Here's an alternative acronym. Acronym version 2. Instead of the first one, you can use this acronym. So this acronym may appeal to some people. Sri Sabri or Sasri, motor engine must be repaired. The B here is not used, okay, but it's just put in to make the sentence more grammatically correct, okay? Or if you want it in broken English, it's motor engine must repair. So it's up to you whether you want to use the first acronym or the second acronym. Okay, the first acronym is Sri Sabri, motor emak mudah rosak, right? This one is motor engine must be repaired. So you can choose. All right, but I will use the first acronym when I discuss the answers to the essay questions. So to discuss the pathway of transmission of information in either a voluntary or involuntary action, here is the framework for your essay answer, which you can copy and use to answer questions on this topic. Okay, discussing the pathway of transmission of information. All right. So firstly, you must mention what the stimulus is. So the stimulus is, okay, it's mentioned. For example, the sound of the teacher's voice asking a question, right? Receptors in a sensory organ detect the stimulus. So mention what type of receptors it is that detect the stimulus and what is the sensory organ, right? And this triggers a nerve impulse. Then sensory neuron. The sensory neuron transmits the nerve impulse to the control center, which is either the brain or spinal cord, so mention it. Now, for voluntary actions, it is the cerebrum of the brain, all right? And we will find out for involuntary actions, like reflex actions, the spinal cord could be involved. So, if let's say it's a voluntary action, then we can mention number 5. The cerebrum in the brain will interpret information and make a decision, all right? Now, next, relay neuron will receive the information from the sensory neuron, and then it will transmit the nerve impulse from the brain or spinal cord to the motor neuron. Now next, motor neuron at the effectors transmits the nerve impulses to the effectors, and mention what the effectors are. Usually they are the maybe the skeletal muscles of the hand, of the arm, and so forth. And then the effector, which is the muscle, will contract to carry out the response. So mention what the response is that occurs. Maybe the student raises his hand when the teacher asks a question, all right? Or the student answers a question. So that can be the response for voluntary actions. So copy this framework down, and you can use it and adjust it to explain either the transmission of impulses or information in a voluntary action or involuntary action. Now, to recap, SRI is RE, right? In our teaching aid. So in our learning aid here, or our memory aid. So S is for stimulus, R is for receptors, and I is for impulse. Then SABRI, S is for sensory neuron, B is for brain, or it could be SASRI, so the S will be for spinal cord. Then the R is for relay neuron, and another I mentioned the impulse again. All right. Next, motor emak muda rosak. So motor is for motor neuron, emak, the E is for effector, and then the M is for muscle. Effector is usually the muscle, the skeletal muscle. And then response is R. Okay. So copy this out, memorize it, and it will help you to answer the question more easily related to this topic. All right, let's try the first type of action, which is a voluntary action. So what's the pathway of information transmission in a voluntary action that involves the skeletal muscles? Okay, take the case of a teacher asking a question to the class, and then students think about the question, and then one of them raises his hand to answer the question. Okay, so what is the pathway of information transmission, or what's the pathway of transmission of information or impulse in this type of voluntary action? Okay, so first identify the stimulus. The stimulus is the sound of the teacher's voice asking the question. Okay, so when she asks the question, the sound waves enter the ears of the student, and the receptor for sound in the ear will detect the stimulus. The sound receptors in the ear will detect the stimulus. Okay, so actually the sound receptors are the mechanoreceptors, which you have studied in an earlier topic. So the receptors for sound in the ear detect the stimulus, and this triggers a nerve impulse. So the nerve impulse is produced by the receptor and then transmitted by the sensory neuron. Okay, sensory neuron transmits the impulse to the brain. Right, this is the sensory neuron. And then with the cell body at the side. Number 4, the impulse will reach the cerebrum of the brain, and the cerebrum will interpret the nerve impulse to understand what the teacher is saying, and then the cerebrum will think and make a decision. The cerebrum of the student will make a decision, and it sends out a new impulse through the relay neurons. Okay, so relay neuron will transmit the impulse to the motor neuron, and the impulse will come out from the brain to the effectors. Okay, so motor neuron transmits impulse to the effector, and this effector are the muscles of the arm, right? So the skeletal muscles, like the triceps muscle here in the upper arm, will contract. All right, certain muscles will contract so that Jack or a student, any student can raise his hand to answer the question. All right. Okay, so now let's try to use this information to write an essay answer. Now let's look at this question here and we'll try to answer it. Jack hears his teacher asking a question. He raises his hand to answer the question. Explain the pathway of transmission of information or impulse in this action. All right, 10 marks. So try and fill up the blanks here first for a start and pause the video while you're doing this. Then we'll discuss the answer in a short while. So we're using the acronym Sri Sabri Moto Emak Muda Rosak, okay, here to answer the question and to make sure we have all the components of the coordinating system to show the pathway of transmission of information. Right, let's look at the answer. Now, what is the sound of the teacher's voice? Yes, the stimulus. So you must be able to identify the stimulus, right? The sound of the teacher's voice, asking the question. Now, what is it in the ear that detects the stimulus of sound? Yes, it is the receptors for sound, which are actually the mechanoreceptors. So, receptors for sound in the ear detect the stimulus of sound of teacher's voice, asking the question. The receptors then produce a nerve what? Impulse, correct. Now, what is the neuron that transmits the nerve impulse? Sensory neuron transmits the nerve impulse to where? To what other neuron? Yes, the relay neuron. And where is it found? The control center is the cerebrum of the brain. Okay, so sensory neuron transmits nerve impulse to relay neuron in cerebrum of brain. So in fact, there are many relay neurons that carry this impulse from one to the next. All right. So until it reaches the cerebrum of the brain, then the cerebrum, the brain will interpret the information. Now, this is true for voluntary actions, as in this case, but for involuntary actions, it is different, right? Then the cerebrum makes a decision. So there may be 1 or 2 marks for this. Now, next, what is it that will transmit the nerve impulse from the brain? Okay, a relay neuron transmits the nerve impulse from brain to the next neuron is, yes, motor neuron. Okay. Now then the motor neuron, it will go to the effectors. So out from the brain already, or the control center. Motor neuron transmits nerve impulse to what structure? Yes, the effectors. And identify the effectors, the skeletal muscles of the arm. So the muscles will contract, also important point to note, and produce a what? Yes, a response. Okay. So what is the response? Mention it. Jack raises his hand to answer the question. Okay, so take note of all the keywords and the highlighted words and even the words in blue, right, that are necessary to help you get your 10 marks for this question. Right, so let's look at the sequence of impulse transmission for voluntary actions. This is the conclusion from the first type of action that we are discussing. All right, so when Jack raises his hand to answer a question asked by the teacher, right, as an example, stimulus is detected by the receptor, which produces an impulse that flows through the sensory neuron to the relay neuron in the cerebrum of the brain. So there may be more than one relay neuron. Anyway, cerebrum will interpret information and makes a decision. After that, an impulse is sent from the relay neuron to the motor neuron and then finally to the effector. All right, then the effector will carry out the response. For example, Jack will raise his hand. Now going on to the second type of action, involuntary actions now, involving skeletal muscles, the reflex response, right? So we're going to talk about 2 types of reflex response, the 3-neuron reflex arc and the 2-neuron reflex arc. Let's start with the 3-neuron reflex arc. Several situations require immediate and spontaneous action, or action that occurs automatically without thinking. So if you accidentally prick your finger with a sharp pin, you will move your finger away immediately without much thought. And this is known as a reflex action. All right. So a reflex action is a very fast automatic response to a stimulus without conscious control by the brain. Now, there's a star here to tell you this is an important definition to remember, and is asked frequently in the exam. So the nerve pathway involved in the reflex action is called the reflex arc. Okay, how the nerve impulse moves in the reflex action. That's called the reflex arc. And the reflex action of moving the finger away from a sharp pin actually involves 3 neurons, which are the sensory neuron, relay neuron, and motor neuron. Think of the word serum. Sensory neuron, relay neuron, and motor neuron. It also involves communication between the neurons in the peripheral nervous system and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is involved other than the 3 neurons. Now we're going to discuss the reflex arc involving 3 neurons and the spinal cord. An example is withdrawing the hand from an object that causes pain or a hot object, or moving the finger away from an object that causes pain, right? So we must know how to draw this reflex arc. Draw the sensory neuron, the relay neuron is also involved, and then the motor neuron. All right? So let's start with the stimulus. So the stimulus is the pain from the pin. Now, the stimulus, when the pin pricks the skin, the sensory receptor is stimulated by the stimulus, and it will produce a nerve impulse that travels through the sensory neuron here, past the dorsal root to the spinal cord, right? So in the dorsal root, we have the dorsal root ganglion, which is an accumulation of cell bodies of the sensory neuron. Then in the gray matter of the spinal cord, the impulse is transmitted from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron. So it has to be transmitted across the synapse or gap here also by using neurotransmitters. And then the relay neuron will transmit the impulse to the motor neuron. Okay, it also passes, goes through a synapse here. Okay, the impulse will be transmitted across the synapse here between the relay and motor neuron. Then the motor neuron will transmit the impulse to the effector, which is the muscle in this case, all right, so that the muscle in the hand or in the arm, for example, the biceps muscle can contract and bend the arm or move the finger away from the object, from the pin. All right, so there's a sudden movement of the hand, okay, away from the pin, and that is the reflex action. Okay, that involves 3 neurons: the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, and the motor neuron. Okay. Right, let's go on to the second question for involuntary actions this time, especially the reflex action. All right. Lina moves her finger away when she touches a sharp pin. Discuss the pathway of transmission of information involved in this action or response. 10 marks. Okay. So pause the video for a while and try to write down your answer based on this acronym or this memory aid, Sri Sabri Moto Emak Muda Rosa. Okay. And we will discuss the answer in a short while. Okay, let's look at the answer. The stimulus is the pain which occurs when the pin pricks the finger. So sensory receptors for pain, which are the nociceptors in the skin, detect the stimulus, and this triggers a nerve impulse. Now, the sensory neuron will transmit the nerve impulse to the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, the nerve impulse is transmitted from sensory neuron through the synapse to the relay neuron by using neurotransmitters. All right, we can mention the synapse. We may be able to get one more mark. Now, the relay neuron then transmits the nerve impulse to the motor neuron. Then the motor neuron transmits the nerve impulse to the effector, that is the muscles in the hand. Now the effector, which are the skeletal muscles in the hand, contract to carry out the response, and the response to the stimulus occurs, that is the finger will move away from the pin. We have to mention what the response is. Okay, so altogether 10 marks for this answer. And going through the components here, you'll see that all these components are mentioned. Stimulus is mentioned, and then the receptor is mentioned, all right? Triggers a nerve impulse, I, so Sri, and then Sabri, S for sensory neuron. Now, the B here is actually changed to S, Sri Sasri, all right? Because brain is not involved in this reflex action, because it's in the lower part of the body, below the head. So it's called a spinal reflex. For spinal reflex, the impulse just goes into the is transmitted into the spinal cord, but never up to the brain because it will be too slow. The flow of impulses will be too slow, and then the person may be hurt before he can even move away from the object, all right, that causes pain, or a hot object, or something that can cause injury. All right, so the impulse doesn't go up to the brain in this case. It just travels into the spinal cord and out of the spinal cord. All right, take note of that. So Sri Sasri. Okay, now the S is for spinal cord, R is for a relay neuron, I is for impulse, and then motor emak mudah rosak, M for motor neuron. Emak is effector, E for effector, and then M mudah for muscles. Rosak is actually stands for response, R for response. Right, so as a conclusion, for the sequence of impulse transmission, or the sequence of transmission of information, all right, for a reflex action of moving the hand away from a sharp object or a hot object, the sequence is as follows. The stimulus is detected by the receptor, which produces an impulse that is transmitted by the sensory neuron to the relay neuron in the spinal cord, okay, not to the brain, in the spinal cord. Then the relay neuron transmits the nerve impulse to the motor neuron, and from the motor neuron, the impulse is transmitted to the effector. Okay, now for motor neuron, the cell body is in the spinal cord. Part of it is in the spinal cord. Next, we come to the importance of reflex actions. You can be asked, what is the importance of reflex actions? Okay, so reflex actions produce spontaneous or automatic responses without waiting for a response on instruction from the brain. The brain doesn't have to think about what to do, all right? Because the reflex action occurs automatically without waiting for instructions from the brain. Now, the additional time that's needed by the brain to analyze the information before triggering a response could cause the person to suffer serious injuries if the brain is needed to analyze the information, all right? So if the person touches a hot object and it takes too long for him or her to move away from the hot object, then he may get burnt, right? Okay, so since some reflex actions involve the spinal cord, the brain can focus on higher level thinking, all right? And reflex actions such as coughing protects the lungs from foreign particles in the external environment. So this is to protect the body from damage, right, or from injury. So you can give examples like coughing, that protects the lungs from foreign particles. When we cough out we cough out some of the foreign particles that may have been breathed in from the external environment. All right. Now, the pupil reflex protects the retina from damage. So the pupil is an opening in the center of the eye where the black or brown part of the eye is, and the pupil reflex is a reflex action, a very quick action that causes the pupil to constrict, to become smaller in response to light. If there is more light, then the pupil will become even smaller, and this will adjust the amount of light that reaches the retina, which contains the receptors, right? And the retina is at the back, in the back part of the eye. So to prevent the retina from being damaged by the UV rays and the rays of light, all right? So if the light is too bright, the pupil will constrict or become smaller, all right? So this also has a protective effect on the person. Now we go on to the second type of involuntary action that involves only two neurons. This is called the two-neuron reflex arc. So another reflex action is the knee-jerk reflex or patella reflex. This reflex uses the nerve pathway that involves only two neurons, which are the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. The relay neuron is not involved in the knee-jerk reflex. Okay, the relay neuron is involved in the withdrawal of hand, moving away of the fingers from an object that's hot or causes pain, but it's not in the knee-jerk reflex. So the doctor sometimes tests the effectiveness of somebody's nervous system by tapping the knee. You can see here, tapping the knee with a rubber hammer. So if the knee is tapped with a rubber hammer, in normal circumstances, the knee should jerk forward and upwards like this, okay, when the knee is tapped. So let's find out how this actually occurs. Now let's discuss the knee-jerk reflex, which involves two neurons only and the spinal cord, right? So firstly, when the tendon below the kneecap is tapped. Now this tendon is actually connected to the quadriceps muscle, which is a big muscle at the front of our thigh area here. All right. So when you sit down, you can feel that muscle on your thigh. So this is the quadriceps muscle. All right. Now when the tendon below the kneecap, tendon is a tissue that connects here in this case it connects the quadriceps muscle to the bone below, the tibia below, right? So the patella is somewhere near to it, the middle here. So you tap below the patella, you will tap the tendon, all right, that connects the quadriceps muscle to the bone below, all right? So when the tendon below the kneecap is tapped, then the quadriceps muscle is stretched, all right, because there's a force acting here, pressing here. So this muscle will be stretched. The quadriceps muscle is stretched. Now this is the stimulus. And there's a type of receptor, special receptor called the stretch receptor in the quadriceps muscle that will become stimulated and produces an impulse. So this impulse is transmitted by the sensory neuron to the spinal cord and straight away to the next neuron, which is the motor neuron. All right. So the impulse travels from the sensory neuron past the synapse, the gap in the center here, in between the two neurons, and then to the motor neuron, right? So the motor neuron transmits the impulse to the effector, which is still the quadriceps muscle, the same quadriceps muscle. Then the effector, so when the impulse arrives back at the quadriceps muscle, the effector, which is the quadriceps muscle, will contract because it's stimulated by the impulse. And when it contracts, it will pull the leg upwards. The leg will jerk forwards and upwards. And that's the knee jerk reaction. Okay? So take note that only two neurons are involved, the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So in conclusion, if you are asked to write the sequence of impulse transmission or sequence of transmission of information for a knee jerk reflex, you can write as follows. The stimulus is detected by the receptor, which is actually the stretch receptor in the quadriceps muscle, and it produces an impulse, and then the impulse will flow through is transmitted by the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, all right, spinal cord here, and straight away to the motor neuron, no relay neurons involved, and the impulse is transmitted back to the same quadriceps muscle. So it stimulates the quadriceps muscle to contract, and this will cause the knee to jerk upwards. Now let's watch an animation of the knee jerk reflex. Now let's try this question. A doctor tests the knee jerk reaction of his patient by tapping his knee. Discuss the pathway of transmission of information involved in this reflex. All right. So take a moment to write down your answer, like an essay question. And remember your memory aid. If you don't know where to start, think of the memory aid. Sri Sabri Moto Emak Muda Rosak. All right. So that you can recall the altogether 11 components here that you have to mention in your essay answer. All right. So pause the video for a while and try the question. And we'll discuss this in a short while. All right, let's look at the answer. Now, first, S stands for stimulus, right? So the stimulus is the stretching of the quadriceps muscle, okay? The muscle here, the blue one, when the tendon in the knee is tapped. So when we tap the tendon, then it stretches the muscle, right? And the stretching of the muscle is the stimulus because the receptor involved are the stretch receptors, right? So stretch receptors detect any changes in any stretching of the quadriceps muscle. Thus, stretch receptors are stimulated, and number 3, it triggers a nerve impulse in the receptors here, the green ones. So we have discussed the S, the R, and the I. Now let's go on to the word Sabri. Now S, sensory neuron transmits the nerve impulse to the spinal cord, right? Now instead of B, it should be S for spinal cord. So Sasri, Sasri. So then there's the brain is not involved, right, in this knee-jerk reaction or reflex. Next, in the spinal cord, the nerve impulse is transmitted from the sensory neuron through the synapse here, the gap here, to the motor neuron. Okay, so relay neuron is not involved. So we have discussed the word motor, standing for motor neuron. Now, motor emak mudah rosak, right? So E for effector. The motor neuron transmits the nerve impulse to the effector, that is the quadriceps muscle itself again. Okay, so quadriceps muscle has the receptor and it is also the effector. And then M for muscle, and then next we come to R. The quadriceps muscle contracts to carry out the R for response. And what is the response? We have to mention. The response is that the leg jerks forward and upwards as the quadriceps muscles contract. Quadriceps muscle contracts here. Okay? Now let's look at some questions in this formative exercise. 12.4. What is the sequence of impulse transmission in the knee-jerk reflex arc? 2 marks. All right, so this first question is asking you for the sequence of impulse transmission. So you have to mention things like receptors, the types of neurons, the control center, and so forth. And use an arrow to denote the sequence of events. All right? So try this yourself first for knee-jerk reflex. What are the neurons involved and what are the other components involved? Okay, to cause the knee-jerk reflex to occur. All right, starting from stimulus. Now, next, state the definition of reflex action and its importance. Okay, what is the meaning of reflex action and what is the importance of reflex action? So here is 4 marks. Okay, so think of 4 points to state. Maybe 1 or 2 points for the definition, and also 1 or 2 points, 2 points for the importance, or 3 points about its importance. All right. Okay, so you can pause the video a while and try to answer this question, and we will discuss the answer in a short while. All right, let's look at the answers. Now, the sequence of impulse transmission in a knee-jerk reaction, knee-jerk. So we know that only 2 neurons are involved. All right. Okay, not 3. 2 neurons are involved. Now, what's the neuron that's not involved? It is the relay neuron. The relay neuron is not involved, as we have discussed earlier. So there's a mistake in certain books that give the answer, because certain books put relay neuron. Relay neuron is not involved at all. So we can write it like this. Start with the stimulus. Okay, so stimulus is detected by the receptor. Then the receptor will produce an impulse that flows or is transmitted by the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. And then in the spinal cord, the sensory neuron will transmit the impulse through the synapse to the motor neuron. All right, so relay neuron is not involved. And then from the motor neuron, the impulse is transmitted to the effector, such as that is the quadriceps muscle of the leg that will contract and cause the leg to jerk upwards. Okay. And then secondly, number 2, state the definition of the reflex action and explain its importance. So you have to memorize this definition. Okay, a reflex action is a fast automatic response to a stimulus. That's 1 point, without conscious control by the brain. 2nd point. Now, its importance. You can give 2 importance or 2 points related to importance and then an example. So reflex actions are important to protect us from life-threatening situations or threatening situations, and it will increase the chances of survival for us in the ever-changing environment. Okay, so For example, a reflex action such as coughing can protect the lungs from foreign particles that may have been breathed in, okay, from the environment. So one tick is 1 mark here. 2 more questions here, so you can read through the questions and then pause the video for a while and try to answer the questions. Right, let's look at the answers. Now, number 3, state the differences between voluntary and involuntary actions. So since it's 3 marks, we have to give 3 differences. All right, 1 difference, 1 mark. And in each difference, you must mention about the voluntary action and the involuntary actions. Okay, so A, a voluntary action is an action that we are conscious of and is done on our own free will, but an involuntary action is an action that occurs automatically without us being conscious of it, and it is not controlled by our will, right? Now, second difference, a voluntary action involves the somatic nervous system, but an involuntary action involves the autonomous nervous system. Third difference, a voluntary action is controlled by the cerebral cortex, but an involuntary action is controlled by the medulla oblongata and hypothalamus. Okay. Next, a student walks back to his classroom after a meal in the canteen. Explain why he is conscious of his action of walking but not conscious of peristalsis occurring in his digestive system. So he's aware of walking because this action is a voluntary response under his conscious control. It's a voluntary action, right? And this action is controlled by the cerebrum, which is related to the conscious mind, all right? Now, he's not aware of the food digestion in the digestive tract. He's not aware of peristalsis. He's not aware of peristalsis because peristalsis is an involuntary process or response or action which is not under his conscious control. It's controlled by the medulla oblongata. So actions by the medulla oblongata are not under our conscious control. Right, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for viewing. Please do share, like, and subscribe. And all the best for your exams. Goodbye for now.